Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the Banana Boy Paradise Podcast, Episode 2. I know it's been a while since I've made an episode, and to any that have watched my first episode or haven't, I implore you to please go watch and subscribe to the channel if you like this content. Today's topic, as you probably read in the thumbnail that I want to talk about, is the crisis of rationality. Personally, I'm not sure when or how this epidemic I call the Great Brain Drain has started, nor was I even aware in terms of how bad it really was. I think the first time I even had a clue about it was when I was almost finishing college and I was doing a co-op program, finishing my course with this lawyer as my supervisor. Now, I don't want to get into too many details about it, but at the time, he had 20 years of experience, and he told me one day when we were having our regular routine talks or discussions in his car, since he travels a lot, is that people these days are intellectually lazy. Now, mind you, this was back in 2009, my supervisor said this. Now, we're in 2023, where the whole goddamn world is trying to get back right side up when it was upside down for literally, I would argue, 2 to 3 years since the pandemic started in 2020. How in the blue did we get to this point? How did we go from being somewhat of a sane and functioning society from way back, as far as I know, to now this banana-crazed, no pun intended, but this banana-crazed society promoted in all of our social institutions, where we are either persuaded or coerced into thinking that reality doesn't matter if it doesn't consider our feelings. How did we get to such a point of infantile thinking is one of the questions I have. I read an article the other day that was titled, "It's Just My Opinion and the Burden of Proof," on the Education World website. Ironically, it's an opinion piece, but a rational one that deserves a look, which is why I left a link in the description box below for you, the audience, to personally read for yourselves. It's a pretty short article, so good for people with short attention spans. But but to summarize the article, the writer, who's also an educator himself, was addressing the issues that kids today who have access to social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, etc., feel as if their opinions are just as valid as sound evidence and logical reasoning. Now, the writer did address in the article that these social media platforms were a hotbed for unfounded claims, unverified and false information. Just a bit of a quote from the article. But the real meat of the article is basically when our opinions are met with sound evidence and logical reasoning, then what purpose does our opinions serve? What function or purpose does our personal opinion serve when faced with sound evidence and logical reasoning? Because the definition of an opinion is judgment that can be based on fact or knowledge. It doesn't have to be, according to the article. According to Google, an opinion means a view or judgment not necessarily based on fact or knowledge. So it's well established now in terms of what the definition of an opinion is. We got a baseline of understanding now. But so now I will pose the same question the article asks at the beginning. What value does an opinion hold once it comes against sound logic and observable evidence? What value does it hold in discussions that pertain to economics, public health, legislation, and other issues that require more answers in the form of empirical evidence than just an opinion? The answer is that it doesn't have value, at least in the context of addressing social issues. A person's opinion that's driven without sound logic and observable evidence is as valuable as the dog doo-doo that messes up your new kicks that you just bought for $200+. Sorry for being a little extra here, but I just wanted to really just stick it to the audience here about it. So what do we do about this? How can we better communicate our ideas to better build dialogue in terms of understanding social issues, or really the current state of affairs we live in? According to the article, the writer mentions that he has all but given up in terms of asking his students the phrase, end quote, "What's your opinion on blank?" Fill in the blank. What this phrase often leads to are students giving their own personal recollections of their own immediate environments that they themselves have experienced at that time and moment. In other words, repeating, rephrasing media sound bites, or even repeating many of the same arguments regurgitated all throughout social media platforms, or within their own specific communities or spheres within their platforms. When this type of behavior is rewarded and reinforced by these social media platforms, in effect, critical thinking is disregarded since there's no incentive for it. I would even argue further that social media platforms such as TikTok and YouTube, for instance, engage in behaviors of disincentivizing critical thinking through censorship actions against its users that use their platform. Now, whether censorship is right or wrong is not the real question, but the question of whether social media platforms should have the sole power to decide the general conscious thought of the populace is as Orwellian as it gets. Unfortunately, questions like this will probably put me on Susan's radar in terms of my content. Sorry, Susan. The writer's treatment for this type of problem with his students dealing with social media are two questions he would pose to his students when something is up for discussion. The two things are, what do you know about blank? Pretty much, what do you know about the subject? And two, what conclusions have you made from this information about the subject, right? So what do you know about the subject, and what conclusions have you made from this information about the subject? So this method proposed by the writer gives the person who would normally opt to freely express their opinion to not only critically think about it, but it also forcibly puts the burden of proof on them to justify their claims. It's quite the effective method. It encourages intellectual honesty rather than dishonesty. It would also encourage intellectual curiosity about a topic or subject that could create an opportunity for deeper dialogue. Now, the caveat with this approach that the writer highlights in the article is that there's a possibility that it could leave people vulnerable. In other words, it could leave people feeling stumped And then they resort to claiming ignorance, which results in the process of diminishing returns. Now, I'm not going to dive too much into the article because I want to give you, the audience, a chance to read it for yourselves. And hopefully, if you come to a similar conclusion, a similar or different conclusion, please leave your comments about it in the comment section below. So what do I think about this overall? Well, I think we are in a crisis of rationality, as titled in the description of the video, of epic proportions, I would say. This lack of thinking shows in our lack of understanding when it comes to politics. It shows when it comes to our lack of understanding economics at a basic level. It shows when it comes to our lack of understanding when it comes to our education system. It shows when it comes to our lack of understanding when it comes to the news we watch daily. And the list goes on and on and on. Intellectual laziness, or pretty much a brain drain, has taken effect within our social institutions that has caused a disintegration in terms of credibility as a result. We've replaced critical thinking with critical feelings, where there are no universal truths, there are no objective truths or empirical evidence, just interpretations, aka my truth. I'm talking to you, Oprah, but as a consequence of us humans adopting this deleterious doctrine of my truth, we have come to war with our very own existence as a species in terms of the reality of what we are as a result. To put simply, by replacing critical thinking with this emotional uber alles environment we live in, we replace our own awareness of our own agency as human beings. The absence of not acknowledging our own agency is the result of our own failure in terms of assuming responsibility and authority of our own existence as a species. Now, for the topic of responsibility and authority, it's a topic that I feel needs its own episode since I have a lot to cover about it. But for this episode, I'm using it as a preface for the topic of the crisis of rationality and how it's connected with responsibility and authority, which leads to the question of the degree of awareness we have in terms of our own agency as humans. The surrender or absence of critical thinking is the surrender or absence of responsibility and authority. It's the admittance of one's claim to bigotry or ignorance, thus a collapse of a person's preconceived notion of their own credibility. I know I keep repeating myself or beating a dead horse here on this topic, but what I want the audience to understand is this. When we watch these podcasts, new media or engagement media platforms, and forgive me for my own ignorance for not knowing the proper classification for such platforms mentioned, but the questions I have when watching people on these platforms giving their own opinions about certain topics are this. Have they done enough of their own research where they can give a reasonable or well-informed opinion about the subject? The statements made by these people in discussions, are they making statements of facts that can be verified? Or are they solely talking about their own personal experiences? And if they're talking about their own experiences, how much relevance or value their experience have when it comes to the topic? For example, a lawyer sharing his own personal experience or legal opinion about the subject of law as opposed to a person who's gone to law school for 10 years giving their own opinion about the subject of law through Google search, who is a credible authority on the subject. I wonder. I leave that for you, the audience, to decide whether you run into legal troubles. Now, I'm going to close out this podcast with a quote from none other than, for lack of better words, the famous Thomas Sowell, to put a cherry on top for the theme of this podcast. And the quote goes as follows. It takes a considerable amount of knowledge to know the extent of your own ignorance. And I will repeat. It takes a considerable amount of knowledge to know the extent of your own ignorance. I'm Jay Moody, and thank you for watching the Banana Boy Paradise podcast, and I hope you all have a wonderful New Year's. Good day.